The first thing Lucy felt was the cold. Not the gentle chill of an autumn morning, but the kind of cold that settles into bones like iron. The kind that makes a person wonder if warmth was ever real at all. She pressed her back against the stone wall of the granary, her gray cloak pulled tight around her shoulders, the rough wool damp from the night's frost. Her fingers were numb. She had stopped trying to warm them an hour ago. The village of Ashfen was still dark, the sky above the thatched rooftops a deep, bruised purple. In a few moments, the morning bell would ring from the temple tower, and the servants of the Caldwell estate would begin their rounds. If any of them found her here, crouched between sacks of grain like a stray animal, she would not simply be punished. She would be returned. And she could not be returned. Lucy pressed her fingers against her left cheek. The skin there was swollen and tender, a map of last night drawn in shades of blue and deep red. Lord Cedric Caldwell had a heavy hand and a short temper, and Lucy had learned both lessons long ago. But last night had been different. Last night, he had spoken words she was never meant to hear. Words about a bargain, about a debt, about a girl with Omega blood being worth more than gold to the right buyer. She had not waited to learn who the buyer was. Her boots were thin, the leather cracked at the heel, and every step on the frozen earth sent a sharp sting up through her ankle. She had no coin, no food, nothing but the cloak on her back, and a single clear thought driving her forward. Reach the crossroads before sunrise, and follow the northern road away from Caldwell lands. What lay north, she was not entirely certain. Stories, mostly. The great Iron Vale forest, the fortress city of Drakenmoor, and beyond all of it, the territory of the Lycan king. She tried not to think about that part. She made it past 3 streets before the hound caught her scent. The bark split the silence like an axe through wood, and Lucy ran. Her braid flew behind her as she cut through the narrow alley between the baker's house and the old mill, her boots slipping on the frost-slicked cobblestones. Behind her she could hear the handler's voice cursing, the rattle of a chain, and then nothing. The hound had been called back. She did not slow down. By the time pale gray light began bleeding over the eastern hills, Lucy had left Ashfen far behind. The northern road stretched before her, a pale ribbon of packed earth cutting through fields of dead winter grass. The wind came down from the hills with teeth in it, carrying the sharp scent of pine and distant snow. She pulled her hood up and kept walking, counting her breaths to keep herself steady. She did not let herself think about the bruise. She did not let herself think about Lord Cedric's voice, low and deliberate, speaking her name to a shadowed figure on the other side of a door. She did not let herself think about what the word sold meant when it was attached to a person. She only walked. She had been on the road for perhaps 2 hours when she heard the horses. Not 1 or 2. Many. The deep, rhythmic thunder of a large company moving at speed, coming from the south behind her. Lucy stepped off the road immediately, pressing herself into the ditch beside a row of bare-branched willows, pulling her gray cloak around her, and going utterly still. They came fast. 12 riders at least, all in dark armor, black cloaks streaming behind them like smoke. Their horses were enormous, war-bred animals with iron-shod hooves that shook the ground. At the front of the column rode a figure who stood apart from the rest, not by any decoration or banner, but simply by presence. He was broader than the men flanking him, his black braided hair swept back from a hard jaw, dusted with dark stubble. Even at a distance, even in the gray morning light, there was something about him that made the air feel heavier. Lucy pressed herself lower into the ditch. The column thundered past without slowing. She released a breath she had not known she was holding. And then one of the horses stumbled at the edge of the road, its rider pulling hard on the reins, and the animal's iron shoe struck the frozen earth not 2 feet from where Lucy crouched. The rider looked down. Their eyes met. The guard's expression shifted from surprise to sharp recognition. Not of her, but of something she carried without knowing. Her scent. The unmistakable, Unguarded scent of an omega who had never been bound, never been marked, traveling alone on a winter road with a bruised face and frightened eyes. He raised his fist, and the entire column halted. Lucy stood slowly. There was no point in running. Even if her legs had not ached from hours of walking, these were Lycan riders. They would catch her before she reached the willow trees. The guard who had spotted her said nothing. He simply turned his horse and rode back toward the front of the column, where the large figure in black waited without moving. She watched the exchange from where she stood, hands clasped at her waist, chin lifted. Not from pride, but because letting it drop felt like surrender. She could not hear what the guard said. She could only watch the broad shoulders of the man at the front go very still. And then he turned. Even across the distance, the weight of his gaze landed on her like a stone dropped into still water. His eyes, blue, pale, and cold as winter ice, moved over her face, and Lucy watched something shift behind them. Not softness, not pity. Something quieter and more dangerous than either. He said something. Short. Quiet. She could not hear the words. But the guard who delivered them rode back to her and spoke them plainly. "The king commands you approach." Lucy looked at the man at the head of the column. King Draven of Drakenmore. The Lycan king. The man every frightened story told by firelight was built around. She took one step forward, then another, and when she finally drew close enough for him to see her face fully, the bruise across her cheekbone, the split at the edge of her lip, the dried blood she had not been able to clean. Something happened that she would spend a long time trying to understand. His jaw tightened. The pale blue eyes went dark at the edges. The massive warhorse beneath him shifted restlessly, responding to something in its rider that the animal understood before any human could name it. And King Draven, who had never once in living memory been known to explain a command, turned to his captain and said 4 words in a voice so controlled it could only mean the opposite of calm. "She rides with us." Lucy did not argue. She did not have the strength, and something told her, some quiet, animal instinct buried deep beneath fear and exhaustion, that arguing with this man was not the kind of mistake a person made twice. What she could not explain, even to herself, was why the sound of those 4 words made the cold in her bones ease, just slightly, for the first time since she had fled into the dark. No one offered her a hand up. That was fine. Lucy had been climbing onto things without help for as long as she could remember. Hay carts, fence posts, the high window ledge of the Caldwell kitchen when she needed air, and the door had been barred from the outside. She gripped the saddle of the spare horse they brought forward and pulled herself up in one motion, ignoring the protest of her sore muscles and the way her cracked boots slipped against the stirrup leather. She settled into the saddle and kept her eyes forward. The column moved again immediately, as though she had always been part of it. No one spoke to her. The riders on either side kept their gaze fixed ahead, their dark cloaks snapping in the wind, the black iron of their armor gleaming dull in the pale morning light. Lucy rode between them like something they had collected along the road, which, she supposed, was exactly what she was. She told herself that was fine too. What she could not quite manage to dismiss was the awareness of King Draven riding ahead of her. She could not see his face from here, only the broad line of his shoulders beneath the black fur mantle, the long braided ropes of dark hair moving against his back, and the absolute stillness with which he carried himself despite the speed of the horse beneath him. He had not looked back at her since giving the command. He had not spoken again at all. She had no idea what he intended to do with her. The thought should have terrified her more than it did. They stopped at midday in a narrow valley where a frozen stream ran between walls of dark pine. The riders dismounted with practiced efficiency, and servants who seemed to materialize from nowhere began tending to horses, building a fire, and laying out provisions on a low folding table of dark wood. Lucy dismounted on her own and stood beside her horse, uncertain whether she was permitted to approach the fire. Her hands had passed beyond numbness into a dull, constant ache, and her stomach had been empty since the evening before. She watched the flames take hold in the ring of stones and said nothing. "You will eat." The voice came from directly behind her. She turned. King Draven stood 3 feet away, and up close he was. Larger was not precisely the right word, though it was true. It was more that he occupied space differently than other people, as though the air around him had weight. His pale blue eyes were fixed on her face, and he was doing it again. That careful, assessing stillness, like a man reading a document written in a language he was still translating. Lucy straightened. "Thank you, my lord." "Your Grace," said a voice from beside the fire, sharp and dry as winter kindling. She turned to find a man watching her with open displeasure. Lean, sharp-featured, perhaps 40 years of age, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of eyes that catalogued everything and trusted nothing. He wore the dark armor of the Royal Guard, but carried himself with the particular authority of a man who gave orders rather than followed them. "When you address the king, you say your grace. Were you raised in a barn?" "Kaelin." The single word from Draven was quiet, but the lean man closed his mouth immediately. Draven's gaze had not left Lucy's face. He studied the bruise along her cheekbone with an expression that gave nothing away, except that his jaw had done that thing again, that slow, controlled tightening, like a door being pulled shut from the inside. "Eat," he said again, and walked away toward the far edge of the camp. Lucy ate. Dried venison, hard bread, and a cup of something warm and herbed that the serving boy pressed into her hands without meeting her eyes. She sat on a fallen log near the edge of the fire and ate everything they gave her with quiet, practiced efficiency. The way a person eats when they have learned not to take food for granted. The man called Kaelin positioned himself nearby. He did not pretend to be doing anything else. He simply watched her, arms folded beneath his cloak, with the focused attention of someone cataloging a potential threat. After a few moments, Lucy looked up and met his gaze directly. "Is there something you wish to ask me?" He raised an eyebrow. "Several things, beginning with your name." Lucy. "Pack?" "None. Unbound Omega traveling the northern road alone in winter." He said it flatly, as though reading charges at a hearing. "With injuries to her face, running from something. That is not a question." "No," he agreed. "It is an observation. The question is, from what?" She considered him for a moment. He was not cruel, she decided, not in the way Lord Cedric was cruel, which was the only kind she had personal experience with. He was suspicious, which was different. Suspicious she could understand. "From a man who intended to sell me." Kaelin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sell you to whom?" "I did not stay to find out." A pause. Something moved behind his expression. Not warmth, but perhaps the first faint shadow of reassessment. "Lord Caldwell's lands border the southern edge of Ashfin territory," he said, almost to himself. Then, louder. "And you thought the northern road was a safer choice than the eastern route to the Free Towns?" "The eastern route passes through Caldwell's hunting grounds." She looked back at the fire. "I chose the road with fewer of his men on it." Silence stretched between them. When she glanced up again, Kaelin was still watching her, but differently. The cataloging had not stopped, but its purpose seemed to have shifted. "You think clearly for someone who spent the night in a ditch," he said at last. She could not quite tell if it was a compliment. "I have had practice." They rode through the afternoon without stopping, and by the time the sun began dropping behind the tree line, the road had changed beneath them. The packed earth gave way to fitted stone, and the forest on either side grew older and darker. Massive pines with trunks like ancient columns, their branches interlocked above the road in a canopy that muffled sound and turned the remaining light silver-gray. Drakenmore announced itself before it came into view. First there was the smell. Wood smoke and iron, pine resin and something deeper, older, that Lucy could not name but felt somewhere beneath her ribs. Then there were the lights, amber and steady, appearing between the trees one by one like fireflies waking. And then the gates rose out of the dark, black stone, impossibly tall, carved with running wolves, whose eyes had been inlaid with pale blue stone that caught the torchlight and glowed. Lucy looked up at them and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Small. Truly, completely small. Not in the way Lord Cedric's contempt made her feel small, which was a smallness built from cruelty. This was different. This was the smallness of standing before something ancient and enormous and real, and understanding for the first time the true scale of the world she had been living in the margins of. The gates opened. Draven rode through without slowing, without looking up. As if he had passed beneath those carved stone wolves 1,000 times, and would pass beneath them 1,000 more. And the weight of what they represented had long since become simply the weight of himself. Lucy rode through after him, and somewhere in the fortress above, a bell rang once, low and resonant, rolling out across the stone courtyards and the torchlit walls, announcing the king's return. No one had told her yet what would happen next. No one had explained why she was here, or what the king intended, or whether the safety she felt, fragile and strange and entirely without foundation, was real or simply the most elaborate trap she had ever walked into. But the gates closed behind her with a sound like thunder, and the cold outside vanished, and Lucy exhaled slowly into the torchlit dark of Drakenmore. For tonight, at least, she was inside the walls. What she did not see, because she was looking up at the fortress rising above her, was Draven. He had stopped his horse in the center of the courtyard, and he had turned, just slightly, just enough, to watch her pass through the gates. His captain appeared at his shoulder. "You know this will cause talk," Kaelin said quietly. "It already has." Draven's voice was flat. "She is unclaimed, unbound. The nobles will... I know what the nobles will do." He watched Lucy dismount in the torchlight, watched her straighten her gray cloak with quiet dignity, despite her exhaustion, despite the bruise that had deepened to a dark, ugly purple against her pale cheek. Find out everything about Lord Cedric Caldwell. Kaelin went still beside him. "Your Grace." "Everything, Kaelin." A pause. Then carefully, "And the girl?" Draven turned his horse toward the great hall without answering. But his jaw was set, and his pale blue eyes had gone the color of ice just before it fractures. Still and surface calm and under tremendous pressure from below. Kaelin watched him go, and felt, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain about what was coming next. They gave her a room in the eastern wing. Not a servant's cell. Lucy had expected that, had already prepared herself for a straw pallet and a single tallow candle and walls that wept moisture in the cold. Instead, the woman who led her through the torchlit corridors, a stout, brisk beta named Marin with iron-gray hair pinned severely at the back of her head, opened a door onto a chamber that made Lucy stop breathing for a moment. A hearth, a real one, already lit. The fire built high and generous behind an iron grate. A bed with a wool-stuffed mattress and blankets the color of dark forest moss. A basin of water on a carved wooden stand, still steaming faintly. A single window with real glass in the leaded frame, overlooking a torchlit courtyard below. "His Grace's orders," Marin said, in the tone of a woman who had long since stopped attaching personal opinion to the things she was asked to do. She set a folded bundle of clothing on the foot of the bed, a clean linen underdress, and a heavier tunic of undyed wool, simple but whole, without patches. "There is water for washing. You will take the evening meal here tonight. Tomorrow morning you will present yourself to the King's Hall at the first bell. Lucy touched the edge of the wool blanket. It was softer than anything she had worn against her skin in years. "Why?" she asked. Maren paused at the door. She looked back, a proper look, not the cataloging assessment Kaelin had given her, but something closer to genuine appraisal. Taking in the gray cloak still damp at the hem, the cracked boots, the braid coming loose after a long day, and above all the bruise that had continued its slow bloom across Lucy's cheekbone throughout the day until it now spread from her eye socket to the edge of her jaw in shades of deep violet and greenish yellow. "Because the king commands it," Maren said finally. And then, softer, in a register she clearly did not use often. "Wash your face carefully. There is a pot of healer's salve on the windowsill. Pine resin and calendula. It will help the swelling." She left before Lucy could respond. Lucy washed slowly, with great care. The water in the basin was warm enough to draw the deep cold out of her fingers, and she held her hands submerged for a long moment, eyes closed, breathing the faint herbal scent that drifted up with the steam. Then she cleaned her face, wincing when the cloth passed over her cheekbone, and changed into the clean clothes Maren had left. The linen underdress was plain and a little large at the shoulders, but it was clean, and that alone felt extraordinary. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her fingers carefully against the pot of salve, then touched it to her cheek with the practiced lightness of someone who had tended her own injuries many times before. The scent of pine resin rose sharp and clear in the warm room. A serving girl brought food, a bowl of thick broth with root vegetables and barley, a heel of bread still warm from the ovens, a small pottery cup of watered wine. Lucy ate every bit of it. Then she sat in the chair beside the fire with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, and she let herself do what she had not permitted since leaving Ashven. She thought. Lord Cedric had been selling her. That much she knew. She had heard her name spoken through the door, and the word Omega, and a figure. A sum of coin so large it had made her stomach drop. The shadowed figure who had come to Caldwell's Hall in the dead of night had not been a merchant. The language had been wrong for that, too deliberate, too cold. She did not know the name he had used. She only knew the word that had accompanied it. Acquisition. She stared into the fire and turned that word over and over, and tried very hard not to attach it to the reality of what it meant when applied to a person. The question she could not answer, the one that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the frozen road that morning, was simpler and more unsettling than any of it. Why had the Lycan king looked at her face the way he had? 2 floors above her, in the map room of the central tower, King Draven stood over a table covered in parchment and said nothing for a long time. Kaelin stood across from him. Between them, weighted at the corners by iron blocks, lay a document, a land registry from Ashven territory, several seasons old, and beside it a fresher parchment covered in the cramped handwriting of one of Drakenmoor's border scouts. Kaelin had been thorough. He always was. "Cedric Caldwell," Draven said at last. Not a question. 4th son of the Caldwell line, inherited the eastern estate through what several sources describe as circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. Kaelin kept his voice even. He has no direct allegiance to any Alpha Lord. He operates as an independent holder within the borderlands, which means technically he answers to no pack law. Which is exactly why he thought he could do this. The Omega is unclaimed, Kaelin said carefully. Under borderland custom, an unbound Omega without pack affiliation is considered. I know what borderland custom considers her. The words came out very quiet. Quiet in that specific way that made Kaelin go still. That custom exists because no one with authority over these lands has bothered to dismantle it. That ends. Kaelin studied him. 23 years he had served this man. Had served him as a boy prince first, then as a young king inheriting a throne built on ash and war, and now as the sovereign who had spent a decade hammering something stable out of the ruins. He knew Draven's silences the way a sailor knows weather. This one was not grief or doubt. This one was decision, the deep, irreversible kind that moved like tectonic stone. "You cannot reorganize borderland inheritance law in a night," he said. "No." Draven rolled the scout's parchment closed. "But I can send a message that travels faster than law." He looked up. "Take 6 men, ride to Caldwell's estate. I want a full account of every Omega he currently holds under his roof, the terms of their arrangement, and the name of whoever he was selling the girl to." Kaelin's eyes sharpened. "And Caldwell himself." A pause. "He will be brought to Drakenmore to answer for it under Pact Tribunal. That will anger the other borderland holders." "Good." Draven moved toward the door. "Anger is a simple thing to work with. It announces itself. Let them be angry." Kaelin watched him go, then looked back at the parchments on the table. He picked up the scout's report and read the line that had given him pause the first time, the one he had not yet mentioned to the king. The buyer's mark, pressed into the wax seal of the correspondence recovered from Caldwell's courier, bears the insignia of House Vorin. House Vorin. The name sat in Kaelin's chest like a stone dropped into deep water, still sinking. He folded the parchment carefully and tucked it inside his cloak. The king needed to know. But Draven needed one night of clarity first, before the weight of that name landed on everything. Tomorrow would bring enough darkness. Tonight, Kaelin would ride. Lucy did not expect to sleep. She lay in the bed with its moss-green blankets pulled up to her chin and watched the fire burn down through its stages, high and crackling, then settled and steady, then low and amber, breathing slow. The room smelled of wood smoke and pine salve and old stone, and somewhere outside the window she could hear the distant call of a night watch guard making his round along the wall. She thought about Marin's brisk kindness, about the serving girl who had brought food without being asked to explain why, about Kaelin's sharp eyes and the way they had shifted, just slightly, when she had said, "I have had practice." And she thought about Draven, about those 4 words on a frozen road. "She rides with us," about the way his jaw had tightened when he saw her face. Not with disgust, not with the weary indifference she had learned to expect from powerful men looking at damaged things. Something else. Something she did not yet have language for. She was still turning it over when she fell asleep, unexpectedly and completely, between one breath and the next. Outside her door, she did not hear the soft footsteps that paused in the corridor. Did not hear them stop. Did not hear the long, still silence that followed, as if someone had stood there for a moment in the dark, not entering, not leaving. Only listening, through ancient stone walls, to the quieted breathing of a girl who had finally, for the first time in a very long time, stopped running. Then the footsteps moved on, and Drakenmore held its breath around them both. The first bell rang before dawn. Lucy was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed with her braid replaited and her borrowed wool tunic smoothed as flat as her hands could make it. She had been awake for an hour, listening to the fortress come alive around her. The distant clank of the kitchen fires being stoked, the low voices of guards changing their watch, the creak of heavy doors opening and closing in the corridors below. Drakenmore did not sleep so much as pause. Even its stillness had a kind of readiness in it. She pulled her gray cloak around her shoulders. It was still slightly damp at the hem, and it was the only thing she owned. She fastened it at the collar with steady fingers and stood. Marin was waiting in the corridor. "You are prompt," the older woman said, with the mild approval of someone who had spent decades managing people who were not. She turned without further comment and led Lucy through a succession of corridors that grew progressively wider and higher as they moved toward the center of the fortress, the stone walls giving way to paneled dark wood, hung with tapestries depicting wolves, mid-run across winter landscapes, their woven eyes bright with blue thread. The great hall was already occupied. Lucy stepped through the arched entrance and understood immediately that this was not the private meeting she had imagined. A long table of black oak ran the length of the hall, and around it sat perhaps 20 people, men and women both, most in the dark armor of the royal guard, several in the furred robes of pack nobles. Every head turned when she entered. She felt the weight of those collective gazes like a physical thing, pressing against the bruise on her cheek. She kept her chin level and walked forward. Draven sat at the head of the table. He was dressed differently from yesterday, still in black leather armor, but with the royal mantle across his shoulders now. A heavy sweep of black wolf fur that made him look carved from the same stone as the fortress around him. His pale blue eyes found her the moment she crossed the threshold, and he watched her walk the full length of the hall without expression. "Lucy of Ashfen," he said, when she stopped at the appropriate distance. His voice carried easily in the stone space without effort. "Be seated." A chair had been placed, not at the foot of the table, which would have been the expected position for someone of no rank, but midway along it, between an empty seat and a severe-looking woman in gray robes who did not look up from the parchment in front of her. Lucy sat. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. The business of the morning proceeded around her for a time. Reports from border captains, a dispute between two beta lords over grazing rights near the western river, a curandero's account of a fever moving through one of the southern villages. Lucy listened without speaking. She was gathering information the way she had always gathered it, quietly and at the edges, making a map of what she did not yet understand. What she understood so far. Kaelin was absent. The empty seat beside her was his. Several of the nobles kept glancing at her with expressions ranging from open curiosity to barely concealed hostility. The severe woman in gray robes was the king's head record keeper, and her name was Sister Aldrich. And Draven ran his hall the way he sat his horse, with an absolute stillness at the center that everything else organized itself around. It was the hostile glances that told her the most. An older nobleman with a red-veined face and a fur-trimmed robe leaned toward his neighbor and said something behind his hand. Lucy did not catch the words, but she caught Omega and Borderlands, and the particular tone that accompanied both, the one that turned a person's designation into a category of lesser things. She had heard that tone her entire life. It no longer surprised her. What surprised her was what happened next. Draven stopped speaking mid-sentence. The hall went very quiet. His pale eyes moved, slowly, with complete deliberateness, to the nobleman with the red-veined face. He said nothing. He simply looked at the man with the focused, patient attention of someone who has all the time in the world and is prepared to use every moment of it. The nobleman cleared his throat, looked down at the table, said nothing further. Draven resumed speaking as though nothing had occurred. Lucy looked at the surface of the table in front of her and kept her expression neutral. But something small and unfamiliar had shifted in her chest, something she could not immediately name, because she had so little experience with it, the feeling of being defended without being asked. After the hall had emptied, Draven gestured for her to remain. The servants cleared the table around them, swift and silent, and then they were alone in the great hall, the fire in the massive hearth at the far end burning steadily, the smell of wood smoke and tallow candles thick in the air. Outside the high windows, the sky had finally committed to a pale winter blue. He sat at the head of the table, forearms resting on the dark wood, and studied her with that careful, translating attention. "Tell me about Caldwell," he said. Lucy told him. Not everything at once. She was careful, methodical, the way she had learned to be when speaking to powerful people, giving information in the order it mattered, rather than the order it hurt. She told him about the estate, about her designation as a household Omega, about the years of service that had never been freely given. She told him about the night she had escaped, about the door and the voice and the shadowed figure and the word sold. She did not tell him about all the nights before that one. There were limits to what she could say in a single sitting to a man she had known for less than a full day, even if something about the quality of his attention made her want to trust it. She had learned, at considerable cost, not to trust the feeling of wanting to trust someone. Draven listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence that followed had weight and texture, like the air before a storm. "The man Caldwell was selling you to," he said. "Did you hear a name?" "No, only a title." She met his eyes. He was called the Collector. Something happened in Draven's expression. It was small, a fractional tightening around the eyes, gone almost before it was there. But Lucy was very good at reading faces. She had survived by it. "You know that name," she said. It was not an accusation. She kept her voice even, curious, careful, but she did not look away. Draven regarded her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, something shifted in his face. Not quite a softening, more like a door opening one precise inch, enough to let light through without giving up the room. "Yes," he said. "I know it." "Who is he?" Another pause. "A man who has been acquiring unbound omegas from the borderlands for 3 years. We have been trying to find him for 2. His eyes held hers steadily. "You are the first person to have stood in the same room as one of his transactions and walked away from it." The fire crackled in the hearth. Lucy absorbed this and felt the shape of it settle into her understanding with a cold, precise clarity. She was not simply a girl who had escaped a cruel lord. She was, apparently, a witness. "That makes me useful to you," she said quietly. "Yes." He did not soften it or dress it in diplomatic language, and she found she respected that more than she would have respected a gentler answer. "It also makes you a target. Whoever the Collector is, and we have suspicions, he will not be pleased to learn that someone who heard his arrangements is no longer in Caldwell's custody." Lucy looked at her hands on the table, then back at him. "What happens to me now?" Draven leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance between formality and something else that did not yet have a name. "You remain in Drakenmore, under my protection. No one touches you here." She should have felt relief. She did feel relief, a tide of it moving through her exhausted body. But beneath it was something more complicated, a question she could not yet ask because she had not yet decided if she was brave enough to want the answer. Why? Not why in the practical sense. She understood the witness, the investigation, the political logic. Why in the other sense? The sense that lived in the memory of a jaw tightening on a frozen road, of footsteps pausing outside her door in the dark, of pale blue eyes that had not looked at her the way anyone had ever looked at her before. She did not ask it. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said instead. Draven held her gaze for one moment longer than necessary. Then he straightened, and the door opened one precise inch, and it was a wall again. "Marin will show you the grounds," he said. "Learn the fortress. You will be safe within the walls." What neither of them knew, what Kaelin was at that moment riding hard through the northern pine forest to report, was that safe within the walls was already being tested. Because the scout Kaelin had sent ahead had found something at Caldwell's estate that had not been in any of the earlier reports. The estate was empty. Not abandoned. Emptied. Deliberately, quickly, within the last day. Every document, every servant, every record of transaction, gone. And on the door of the great hall, burned into the wood with something hot enough to char stone beneath it, was a mark. A collector's mark. Pressed like a brand into the grain of the ancient oak. A message that needed no words. I know she is gone, and I know where she went. Kaelin arrived at Drakenmore before the afternoon bell. Lucy heard the commotion from the eastern courtyard where Marin had been showing her the herb garden, a frozen sleeping thing in winter, the raised beds covered in straw and burlap, but Myron had walked her through it anyway, naming each dormant plant with the brisk affection of someone who tended living things as a matter of principle. Lucy had listened carefully, grateful for the simplicity of it, for the smell of cold earth and dried lavender, and the ordinary weight of a morning that did not require her to be afraid. Then the gates opened, and Kaelin rode through at a pace that was not ordinary, and Myron's hand closed briefly around Lucy's arm. "Inside," the older woman said, not unkindly, with the quiet authority of someone who has learned to read a fortress's moods. "Now." The council chamber was a smaller room than the great hall, its walls lined with dark shelves of bound records and rolled maps, a single long table of scarred wood at its center. By the time Lucy was brought there, because Draven sent for her specifically, which made Kaelin's expression tighten in a way she noted and filed away, the fire had been built high, and the room smelled of hot pine resin and something metallic that she recognized, after a moment, as the cold that still clung to Kaelin's armor. He had ridden hard. He had not stopped to warm himself. That told her everything about the urgency before a single word was spoken. Draven stood at the head of the table. He looked at her when she entered, a quick, assessing look that moved over her face and then away. Checking, she realized, making certain she was unharmed. The recognition of that settled in her chest with a warmth she did not know how to account for. "Sit," he said, and this time it was not a command so much as a request, wearing the shape of one. Kaelin laid the scout's report on the table. He laid beside it a second document, a rough charcoal rubbing on coarse parchment, pressed from the burned surface of a wooden door. Even in reproduction, the mark was clear, a circle bisected by a vertical line, with a small wolf's head at the bottom, its jaws open. Lucy looked at it and felt the cold that had nothing to do with winter. "How's Vorin?" Draven said. He said it the way a person says the name of something they have been expecting for a long time. "Lord Edric Vorin. He controls 3 territories in the Eastern Highlands and has the allegiance of 4 minor alpha lords who cannot afford to refuse him." He paused. "He has also been systematically acquiring unbound omegas for what his household records, when we have been able to obtain fragments of them, describe as a breeding program." The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Lucy kept her hands flat on the table. "He knows she escaped Caldwell," Kaelin said. He did not look at Lucy when he said it, which told her he was uncomfortable with her being in this conversation. Not from cruelty, she had revised her initial reading of him considerably, but from something closer to protectiveness wearing the mask of pragmatism. The mark on the door was a message. He is telling us he has already moved his operation and that he considers the girl, a brief pause, that he considers Lucy a loose thread. "He will come for her," Draven said, "or send someone." Kaelin finally looked at her. "You are certain you heard nothing else that night? No detail of where they intended to take you, no mention of the route, the timing?" "There was one thing," Lucy said. Both men went still. She had been turning it over since the Great Hall that morning. The fragment she had not been certain mattered. The detail that had seemed too small against everything else. "The man who came to Caldwell's Hall that night, before I ran, I heard him speak of a gathering. He called it the Reckoning Moon Assembly. He said everything would be concluded before the moon turned full." Kaelin's eyes moved to Draven's. Something passed between them. Fast, wordless, the communication of men who have worked alongside each other for decades. "The moon turns full in 4 days, Kaelin said. "Then we have 4 days, Draven said. He straightened, and when he did, Lucy saw it fully for the first time. Not the king who had been careful with her, not the man who had paused outside her door, but the alpha who had held a fractured kingdom together through sheer, unrelenting will. Something in his posture changed, not to harshness, but to a kind of focused clarity, like a blade being drawn to its full length. Send ravens to Lord Harwick and Lord Sane. I want their riders on the eastern road by nightfall. Kaelin, you will coordinate the strike on Voron's eastern holdings. We move in 3 days, before the assembly convenes. And the girl? Kaelin asked, then catching himself. Lucy. Draven looked at her. Not at the problem she represented, not at the witness or the target or the piece on the board. At her. At the woman who had climbed onto a borrowed horse without being asked, who had eaten every scrap of food without shame, who had told him about the worst night of her life in precise, careful sentences, and had not cried once. She stays in Drakenmoor, he said. Under direct guard. No one enters the eastern wing without my authorization. Lucy felt she ought to say something practical, something useful. Instead, what came out was quieter than she intended. Will you be riding with them? A pause. Yes. She looked at the charcoal mark on the table, then at him. Be careful, Your Grace. The room was very quiet for a moment. Kaelin found something interesting to examine on the far wall. And Draven, King Draven, the Lycan king, the man whose name made border lords nervous, held her gaze with an expression that had come fully through the door now, no longer 1 inch but wide open. I will come back, he said, simply, completely, as if it were a promise he had already decided to keep. The 3 days that followed were the strangest of Lucy's life. She was not imprisoned. She was not hidden away in her chamber. Draven had given specific instructions, and those instructions, she gradually understood, were less about containing her and more about ensuring she lacked for nothing. Marin brought her proper winter clothing, a heavier cloak in deep charcoal gray, wool stockings, a pair of boots that actually fit. The kitchens seemed to know when she was hungry before she did. Sister Aldrich, the severe record keeper, appeared one morning with a stack of bound histories of the Pack territories and set them in front of Lucy without explanation, as if it were self-evident that she would want them. She did. She read them all. She also walked the fortress grounds every morning, learning the stones the way Draven had suggested, where the walls turned, where the wind came from, which guards nodded and which kept their eyes forward. She spoke with Marin, who revealed, in small increments and always sideways, that she had served the king's family for 30 years, that she had known Draven since he was a boy of 12, who had watched his father's hall burn and rebuilt it over the following decade with his own hands and the loyalty of people who chose him rather than inherited him. He does not ask for much, Marin told her one evening, mending a hem by the fire in Lucy's room. Never has. But what he asks for, he means entirely. Lucy thought about 4 words on a frozen road. She rides with us. Yes, she said. I believe that. Marin looked at her over her mending with an expression that was almost, not quite, a smile. Good, she said. That means you are paying attention. On the 4th day, at mid-morning, the gates opened. Lucy was in the courtyard. She did not know what had made her come outside. Some shift in the quality of the fortress sounds, some change in the frequency of the activity around her that she had learned, in 3 days, to read. She stood near the bare herb garden with her new gray cloak around her and watched the column ride through. They were all there. All of Draven's riders, and Kaelin at the rear with his characteristic sharp posture, and at the front, Draven. He was not unmarked. There was a cut along his left jaw, already clotted, and dust and dried mud on his armor that told the story of hard riding and harder fighting. But he sat his horse with the same absolute stillness, and his pale blue eyes found her across the courtyard the moment he passed through the gates, as if he had already known exactly where she would be standing. He dismounted, handed his reins to a waiting groom without looking away from her, walked across the courtyard with the measured pace of a man who was restraining the pace he actually wanted to move at. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the cut clearly, and the dried mud on his cheekbone, and the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from sleeplessness, but from the weight of hard decisions carried through to their end. "Vorin?" she asked. "Taken." His assembly dismantled before it convened. His voice was rougher than usual, road-worn. 11 Omegas recovered from his eastern holdings. They are being brought to the nearest pack settlements with full protections. A pause. "It is done, Lucy." She absorbed that, all of it. The 11 women she would never meet, but whose lives had shifted because of 4 words on a frozen road, and a girl who had run in the right direction. The assembly that had not happened. The collector who would collect nothing further. She looked at the cut on his jaw. "You need the healer." "In a moment." Draven. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. She had not planned to. It came out the way true things come out, simply, without ceremony. He did not correct her. "In a moment," he said again, quieter. And he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the council chamber, with the door fully open, with something that had been building since a frozen road and a bruised face and 4 words, something that neither of them had yet said aloud, perhaps because some things need time to be certain before they can be spoken. Lucy reached up and touched the edge of his jaw, just below the cut, carefully, the way she might tend any wound, with attention, with intention, with both hands steady. He went very still beneath her touch. "Come inside," she said softly. "Let me help." Epilogue. Spring came to Drakenmore the way it came to old places, slowly, and then all at once. The herb garden woke in increments. First the sage, gray-green and stubborn, pushing through the last crust of frost. Then the lavender, then the thyme, then the small yellow flowers that Maren called sundrops, and cultivated with particular ferocity because she said they had no practical use whatsoever, and that was exactly the point. Lucy learned their names. She learned the names of everything, that winter turning to spring, every guard on the wall, every servant in the kitchen, every carved wolf above every doorway. She read Sister Aldrich's histories until the severe woman began leaving additional volumes outside her chamber door without being asked, which Lucy had come to understand was Sister Aldrich's version of warmth. Kaelin remained suspicious of her for precisely 47 days. She counted. On the 48th day, he told her, with great reluctance and in the tone of a man surrendering to evidence, that her memory of the collectors' gathering had been the single most operationally useful piece of intelligence they had obtained in 2 years. He said it once. He did not repeat it. She thanked him once, and did not repeat that either. After that, they understood each other. Lord Cedric Caldwell appeared before the Pack Tribunal in late winter. He answered for every Omega who had passed through his estate, and for the arrangements he had made on their behalf, and for the coin he had accepted in exchange. The tribunal was not gentle. Neither was the judgment. He was stripped of his lands and his title, and remanded to the custody of the Pack Council, which was, Lucy understood, a considerably less comfortable existence than it sounded. She was not present for the tribunal. She did not need to be. The records were kept. The names were recorded. That was enough. What she was present for, on a morning in late spring, when the sundrops were flowering in the courtyard garden, and the air smelled of pine and new earth and the distant river, was something quieter and more permanent. Draven had asked her 3 days before, in the council chamber with no one else present, using no ceremony and no elaborate language, in the same direct, complete way, he did everything. He had asked if she would stay, not as a witness, not as a ward or a political arrangement, as herself. She had looked at him for a long moment, at the pale blue eyes that had changed her life by simply seeing her, at the man who had rebuilt a kingdom from ash, and done it by choosing people rather than inheriting them. And she had said yes. On the morning of the spring ceremony, Lucy braided her fair hair and pinned it with a small clasp of dark iron that Marin had pressed into her hands without explanation. She wore a dress of deep forest green with a cloak to match, and she walked into the great hall where the pack council and the nobles and Sister Aldrich and every guard who had learned her name were gathered, and she stood beside Draven before the ancient stone altar carved with running wolves. He took her hand. She felt the warmth of it move through her fingers, up through her arm, into the cold places that had been cold for so long she had stopped noticing them. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the door was open entirely now, no longer cautious, no longer measured, simply and completely open. The ceremony was old. The words were older. The meaning was the simplest thing in the world. After, when the hall filled with noise and firelight and Kaelin made a toast that was gruff enough to disguise the fact that it was genuine, Lucy stood with her hand in Draven's and looked around the room at the people who had become, without her quite noticing when it happened, her people. Marin caught her eye from across the hall and gave her a look that was definitely, unmistakably, a smile. The sundrops were blooming in the courtyard, and Lucy, who had spent the whole of her life running from things, and who had finally run in the right direction, stood in the warm stone heart of Drakenmore and felt for the first time entirely still. She was home.